Hey everybody, this is Alec, and for my strategic analysis presentation, I'm going to be doing the company Nintendo. So, specifically, I want to go across a couple main points here. First, being the console wars. I'm sorry, Bob, I know you're not a fan of referring to business in the terms of war, but a lot of people go with the console wars, and that's what I'm going to be going with here. Um, and so, just generally, I want to explain kind of the environment that Nintendo operates in, um, and specifically within that, their position in that environment, and sort of how they have managed to differentiate themselves and develop a competitive advantage. Then I want to talk about some of their more recent products, specifically which ones have been more successful, which ones have been failures, and sort of why those things ended up the way that they did. And then finally, I want to talk about sort of the more recent things that Nintendo's been doing, as well as how likely those new things are, um, how likely those new things will be in succeeding. So to start with the console wars, you've got your big three, and that's Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft. Microsoft creates the Xbox line of consoles, Sony has the PlayStation line, and Nintendo has, the GameCube, the Wii, the Wii U, the Switch. No specific naming system there, but generally it is just these three companies, and there's really kind of a low threat of other entrants kind of getting into this game, mostly because there is a lot of capital involved here. These companies spend a lot of money on research and development. Producing these consoles can be very expensive. They have to work with a lot of other companies in developing games for their consoles. And so there's a lot of industry relationships there that some other a new entrant might not readily have. So ultimately, these three companies are really the ones to focus on. Now, basically, these three companies generally release a console around the same time every couple of years. So, you know, you had the 2005, 2006 generation where Microsoft released the Xbox 360, Sony released the PlayStation 3, Nintendo released the Wii. And then again in the 2012 2013 generation, you had the Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and the Wii U. And then now we've got Microsoft just came out with the Xbox Series X in the end of 2020. Sony released the PlayStation 5 at around the same time. And Nintendo is due for another console release sometime likely in 2021. Now, these consoles are pretty expensive. They go for a couple $100s, and because of that, most people tend to only buy one. There's not too many people who are buying two or all three of these companies' consoles. So, you know, generally only one of these companies will kind of win the console war for that generation. And winning the console war comes with a lot of added benefits to it, mainly being that, the more consoles you sell, the more video games you're going to sell. Because, a lot of video games that are produced in-house by these companies are really only for their consoles. And because of that, if you don't sell a lot of consoles, then nobody's going to buy a game that's only on your console because they don't have the console. So it's part of that whole, software follows hardware idea where, people get their hardware, and then from there, that limits their opportunities for software. So the more consoles that a company sells, the more video game sales they can really expect. So now let's talk about Nintendo's position within these console wars. So Nintendo's generic strategy focuses on broad differentiation. Now, it's broad because they have this sort of family-friendly style to their games. You've got a lot of their characters like Mario and Donkey Kong and Kirby. They're very, um, kind of kid-oriented, and because of that, they can kind of, be well perceived across a lot of different demographics versus something like their competitors, how Microsoft and Sony both tend to have some more mature games on their systems, things like GTA, um, or Call of Duty. And because of that, they have a more narrow differentiation, and they really focus on that sort of demographic of men between the ages of 25 and 34. Now, that being said, even though the focus is a little different there, they all focus on differentiation. Now, while both Sony and Microsoft kind of try and differentiate themselves by having more computing power or more processing power, or better graphics, Nintendo's kind of tried to differentiate themselves in a different way there, where they really focus on having a lot of innovative new features. So that could be something like virtual reality or augmented reality or motion sensing controls with the Wii, which I'm going to go into a little more detail in a bit. But a big reason for this is because Nintendo has this broad differentiation, and they want to get a lot of different people. They generally try and make some simpler games. So having more computing power, having more processing power doesn't really give them a competitive advantage in the way that having some new features that their competitors don't have can really help separate them from both Sony and Microsoft. So now let's kind of look at some of their last consoles. So Nintendo released the Wii in 2006. It was the first console to have motion sensing controllers, and this was, very new, very different way to play video games. Usually people, would just sit on their couch and play on a controller or something. Because it was a little more active, it got a lot more people outside of the general video game consumers. Ultimately, this kind of new innovation really helped drive sales and this new way to play things. And they had over 100 million sales of the Wii, and it was one of the highest sold consoles of all time. Their next product was the Wii U. The Wii U was very similar to the Wii. It also had those motion sensing controls, and the only thing that they really added to it was a touchpad controller. Now, yeah, that is, some level of innovation. It is a little new, but it didn't really change the game the way that, the Wii did when bringing out motion sensing controllers. And the Wii U didn't really, make itself novel in the way that the Wii did. And because of that, it really didn't succeed. It only had about 13 million sales, and is pretty widely considered a failure. That being said, their next product after that was the Switch. Switch is a hybrid console, which means that, while most products like the Xbox One or the PlayStation, those are home consoles, and then you've also got like the PSP, or like the Game Boy or something that are portable consoles. The Switch was a hybrid that allowed you to disconnect the controllers and be able to reformat the console in a way where you could use it both at home or on the go. And this created for a very new style of play. It let people have a lot of new opportunities. And again, just like the Wii, this kind of revolutionized things. And because of that, the Switch has so far been a pretty big success. They've sold over 79 million consoles, and it is still on the market. They're still selling more, so that number could end up being even higher. So now let's look at Nintendo, sort of some of the more recent things they've done and going forward. So right now, Nintendo is really trying to capitalize on the success that they've seen with the Switch. So more recently, they released the Switch Lite, which was a cheaper version of the Switch. It didn't utilize the hybrid console model, but it still got to take advantage of that network effect that the Switch created. A lot of people already had Switches. They were playing games together that were, only available on the Switch. And so far it's doing all right. And now they are, they're due for another console to compete with Microsoft and Sony's 2020 consoles. and it is looking like they are going to release the Switch 2. Not too much is known about the Switch 2. However, based on the name and some of the rumors going around, um, it seems like the Switch 2 is going to be very similar to the Switch, which makes me feel like it's not necessarily likely to succeed. So, as I've said before, Nintendo, they managed to differentiate themselves by having these new interesting features that really help separate them from Sony and Microsoft. And in the same way that the Wii U failed because it really wasn't anything very novel, it was pretty similar to the Wii. And even at that point, Sony and Microsoft had begun making consoles with motion sensing technology. Um, the Switch 2 is in danger of being very similar to the first Switch, which begs the question: what's the point of buying a Switch 2 if you've already got a Switch? Or if even if you have neither, if you want to buy a Nintendo console, what's stopping you from just getting the Switch, which would presumably be less expensive? And if the Switch 2 is very similar, then it seems that the only benefits it would have would be higher computing power or higher processing power, which, that isn't Nintendo's focus. Nintendo doesn't have as much processing power or graphics as Microsoft and Sony. And, they don't need it because, like I said, they have those simpler games for that more, larger audience. And so trying to compete with those other companies on that front isn't really going to yield them a lot of success. They've only really won in the past because they've managed to have these new features. And so at the end of the day, they really need to differentiate the Switch 2 enough from the Switch and from other consoles on the market to justify people, making that investment, spending a couple $100s to get that new console, because otherwise there's no real reason for them to get a Switch 2, when they can just get a Switch or get an Xbox or a PlayStation. Now, even if the Switch 2 is pretty similar, they can still increase their odds somewhat by having a pretty solid line of video games out there that are exclusive to the Switch 2. A lot of the companies like Xbox, PlayStation, or Microsoft and Sony, they both have exclusive games for their consoles. Nintendo has a bunch of exclusive games for their consoles as well. And that can be a driving force in getting people to buy your consoles. However, it isn't sort of a make or break deal there. It is, you can have a couple good games, but, unless you have a lot of good games or some really, really high demand games, it's not going to push you over the edge there the way that having a new innovative feature like the Wii and the motion control settings or the Switch and the hybrid control had. So ultimately, we will probably see this new Nintendo console coming out in 2021. If it is very similar to the Switch 2, then it's probably not going to see the same kind of commercial success that the Wii and the Switch 1 had. But who knows if they can incorporate something new like virtual reality, that a lot of the other consoles are only just kind of getting into, that could definitely up their odds. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I guess we'll see sometime this year or, early next year how that's going between those companies. That's all I have. Thank you guys for listening. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out.